Well, good evening, all. My name's Steven Burt. I am Vice President of the Thoresby, the Leeds Historical Society, and it's my pleasure this evening to share with you the second part of my lecture on the Oates family of Leeds, merchants, lawyers, and explorers, 1700 to 1917. Last year, I described the rise of the Oates family from their arrival in 1700 in the form of Joseph Oates from Chickenley near Dewsbury, through the great years of the 18th century, when the next two generations became phenomenally successful cloth merchants who purchased large tracts of land, particularly in Chapel Allerton, built fine houses, and enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. If you combine the income of Thomas, George, Josiah, and Samuel in that part of the 18th century, they were the largest and most successful family, outstripping the Denisons and the Ibbotsons. Big in politics and Unitarian in religion, they were excluded from the Tory Anglican Corporation, so that it gave them the freedom to concentrate on wealth creation. The great strength of this family lay in its large number of excellent marriage settlements, its ability to adapt to changing economic climates. For example, they proved an extremely rare example of a merchant family who went into manufacturing. In essence, they were risk takers. This evening's lecture takes us from Joseph here through his children, George, Joseph, Henry, and Edward, right the way through to 1917, when Brian Oates eventually sells the final estate of the Oates family in Leeds. But let's just backtrack a little bit to the end of last year's lecture. Joseph Oates had basically invested a fortune with his partners Wood and Smithson in Oakland's Mills, which is just off what is now Meanwood Road. And he'd opened it as a cloth finishing facility. It used the latest, much hated technology and was attacked by the Luddites in 1812. Now, there was a considerable fortune tied up in this mill, and its success was critically important to the family. Nevertheless, Joseph had been an extremely shrewd individual, and he'd helped navigate the company through those difficult times. But he'd also diversified the family's investment portfolio so that in addition to owning land, he'd also invested in infrastructure projects like roads and even a foundry. When the story opens, he is resident in Wheatwood Hall, one of the finest residences in the north of Leeds, as we shall see in a minute. He leased it, but he did not own it. Joseph had three sons, and he also had two daughters as well, surviving. And here they are: George to the left, Joseph Henry, who unfortunately I don't have a portrait of, and Edward. And it's these three sons whose story we will concentrate on today. George and Joseph Henry decided to follow Joseph into being cloth merchants. And Joseph Henry, in particular, had gone out across to Italy and lived for a time in Messina on the island of Sicily, where he hoped to try and expand the cloth trade there. Edward chose a completely different path, and he took advantage of the removal of the obstacles to Unitarians training to be lawyers, and he became an extremely successful solicitor. He made a lot of money. So where were they living? Well, the Oates family of Allerton Hall had moved away, leaving at Carr House, George, at Wheatwood Hall, Joseph, and at the side of Oakland's Mill, Joseph Henry. And I've just put this orange arrow here to show where in future Edward would be buying. So it's all in this section of North Leeds. At the time of Joseph's death, on the 20th of December, 1824, George immediately went from Carr House and went into Wheatwood Hall, his father's residence. There living at the time was Mary, his sister, who had nursed her father through the final years of his life when he'd been particularly ill. Sarah, the other daughter, she had married George William Wood, minister of Mill Hill Chapel, where the family had worshipped basically since 1700. By a complex will, the three brothers and their sister Mary's financial affairs were intrinsically linked, where the bulk of the property had been left to the male heirs as tenants in common. This proved to be an absolute nightmare because it forced them to act together if they wished to dispose of any asset. Mary in particular was vulnerable, but she was at least guaranteed an income from a large property on Paul Lane. As the unmarried woman, her role in the family had already been clear, as she'd looked after her father, and her brother George was quite happy 19 months later for her to go and look after Mrs. Anne Headlam, another relative at Thorpe Arch, who was suffering from cholera. Now, I'm sure when Joseph made his will, he had in mind his sons working in harmony to support each other. And in particular, they would look after their sisters. But I think if you look at this portrait of George, it says everything about the man. The way that jaw is locked at the bottom. He was belligerent, absolutely awkward, and the evidence suggests that he was interested in no one but himself. And so, at the very start of this, Joseph Henry was chosen as the best person to undertake the probate of the will and the division of the estate. But that did not prove easy. Joseph Henry had to keep accurate accounts, which still survive today at the West Yorkshire Archives Service in Leeds. Business, due to the protracted war with France, had proved extremely difficult. There was great volatility in the cloth trade, and by 1825, the situation had not improved for the partners of Oates, Wood and Smithson. The cause of this crisis was confidence in both the UK economy and the stock market, but it was the failure of a noted bank that brought everything to a head. It proved to be the perfect storm. Now, all these factors were outside the control of the Oates family. Despite being a solicitor, Edward still depended on money from his father's estate to supplement his lifestyle. And in February 1825, he was due a payment of at least £400. Now, last time I left the lecture on a cliffhanger when he wrote to his brother Joseph Henry asking where this money was. And Edward replied, "The fact is simply this, and as true as it is simple. We owe Beckett's Bank so much money that without putting a bill of some description into their hands, I dare not ask a renewal of credit at your bank Blings in London. I assure you I have not had it in my power to pay a clothier 1 penny during the last month. But the very first remittance I receive shall go immediately to Beckett's, accompanied by a request to renew your credit at Blins for £400. Nothing came in. The following week, the situation was even more alarming. Joseph was in a desperate state. He wrote to Edward, "Really, money is not available. I've actually suspended payment? No, not exactly. But I have suspended all purchases of every description except bread, meat and potatoes. And I've driven clothiers away with, can't you call again next month?" Edward eventually received £100 instead of the promised 400. It really was a desperate situation. George, however, he had an idea. He thought of letting out Carr House and wanted Joseph Henry's share, leaving Joseph Henry to sort out Oatlands Mill, saying, "Will you live nearby?" This absolutely infuriated Joseph Henry, and he wrote to Edward expressing his frustration. I do not suppose we shall make any exchange of property. He wishes only to rent my portion of Carr House and receive interest for the sum due to him on account of the mill. This plan, however, does not suit me. Joseph was also saddled with the clearance of Edward's property from Wheatwood Hall because his brother wanted shut of it. Edward had left many possessions there, including numerous books and pictures. Not a pleasant situation at all. And to further complicate the matter, their father had invested in a foundry, which all of them wished rid of. And yet, as we shall see, they benefited from foundry later on in the story. Just in the nick of time, the economic gloom lifted. Business improved, and the Oates family, asset rich but cash poor, escaped the fate of many of their contemporaries who had had to declare themselves bankrupt. Business came back with a vengeance, and they really began to have the money rolling in again. Now, it's very sad to relate that when George died without issue on the 17th of October, 1832, at the age of 52, it became possible for all the remaining members of the family to finally reach agreement. George had little time for his family or business affairs, but had been fascinated by politics. He was a staunch liberal who had taken an active role in the party and had even served on the committee at York during the hotly contested election of 1826. This is where he had been living, Carr House. It's to this house that when George died, that Joseph Henry moved. The evidence suggests that he, unlike his older brother, was very kind, caring, industrious, who simply wanted the best for every member of the family. But what of Edward, the youngest of Joseph's sons, the one who'd taken a different path from being a merchant to becoming a solicitor? Before his death, Joseph had been keen for the family to improve its status by obtaining a coat of arms. Joseph asked Edward, even though he was only in his early 20s, to complete this laborious task. He had started the process by liaising directly with the College of Arms in London, and he knew that if this could be achieved, the Oates family could at last be viewed as being of gentry status. He was simply following the path of many other rich merchants like the Denisons and the Ibbotsons, their contemporaries. In essence, the process involved the family proving, through the submission of numerous family trees and letters of support, that they were indeed members of an elite who were entitled to have their own coat of arms. And what you can see here is just an example of one of these pedigrees that Edward submitted. There are literally hundreds of these. Edward was obsessive compulsive, and so this slavish pursuit of information relating to past generations of Oates families and their intermarriage with many of the foremost families of the country suited him perfectly. In 1814, he registered this pedigree at the College of Arms, and the following year a grant of coat of armour was made to all descendants of Joseph Oates and Mary Fenton. Although there was clear evidence to support the family's right to bear arms, it did not stop Edward reminding Earl Marshall, who had it in his power to make this grant, that Hamer Oates of Allerton Hall had been a close friend of his when his Grace had commanded the West York militia. Hardly surprising, then, that it was said that this grant to the Oates family was the most extensive one that the Earl Marshal ever passed. After years of hard work, the Oates family secured this accolade in 1815, but it came at a cost of £75 1 shilling, a fortune then, and it arrived just in the nick of time for it to be included in some of the copies of the brand new history of Leeds, which had been published in 1816 by the Reverend T.D. Whitaker, entitled Lloydis in Elmet. With success behind him, in 1820, Edward travelled to Malta to try and settle a complex case about the release of a cargo held in Valletta that had not been paid for. This case dragged on for 4 years, but in that time, Edward undertook a large amount of work on the natural history of the island, travelled extensively round the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. But eventually he returned to London and enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle in his rooms in Furnival's Inn. But his heart was in Leeds, and he really was a bit homesick and desperate to get back to Leeds as well. And what's so nice is that, again, what survives in the correspondence shows the warmth of the relationship between Edward and Joseph Henry, and how he's trying to help Edward find property in the Leeds area for him. And this is one of the letters. It shows him still at Oaklands, 1825, and this is about investment for Edward's portfolio. Mr. Snow has been here to say that he has seen Rollinson, the owner of the Garth and Cottages near Monkbridge. His price is £550. The property consists of about 1 acre, 3 roods and 20 perches of land, plus 4 cottages and a right shop. And he says the rental borders on £30. Some of the cottages want a complete repair, but the materials all there except a bit of lime. Mr. Snow thinks £50 or £60 would do the job handsomely. Now, there's a mountain of this correspondence. It took 9 years for Edward to find a property that he actually liked. When Joseph had died in 1824, Edward inherited an estate in the north of Leeds between Wheatwood Lane and Hollin Lane, known as the Snow's Mistle Estate. It was a large tract of land, but it wasn't suitable for Edward's purpose, and we'll see what that is in a minute. Edward decided to hang on and on and on, and in 1833, at long last, the property on the other side of the valley, which many of you listening this evening will know because it's Meanwood Park today, then it was called the Rinder Estate. It came up for sale. It had long association with the Worley family, who'd lived there from at least the 16th century and were responsible for developing the whole of that area as an agricultural estate. But when Francis Worley died in 1784, he was the last of the line and left the residue of the estate to his grandniece Anne Rinder, and upon her death to her children. Now, the Rinders were absentee landlords for 50 years and let the 17th century farmhouse and the tannery nearby fall into disrepair. When the local builder, William Wilson, went in to look at the property, he said the back of the house is not inhabited, nor can it be. The ceiling and false roof is bent down and fallen in from the rain, and the roof is open to the sky. The front too's in poor condition, too dangerous to dwell in. But nevertheless, look at the proximity of the Rinder estate to the Snow's Mistle estate he'd inherited it. It was perfect. And for Edward, was in place, put a wonderful house, and to develop the grounds so that they could be landscaped to the most fashionable style. This situation proved absolutely perfect. And so he bought it, and he paid the builder to restore Worley House. With an estate secured, Edward could now turn his mind to other matters. He was now 42 and unmarried. His success as a solicitor assured him it was now time to settle down. He got the money to do so, and so he started to court Susan Grace. So there's Worley House, and here's Susan. She was an accomplished woman, daughter of Edward Grace, an exceptionally wealthy cloth merchant and justice of the peace. She was 11 years younger than Edward, but this is where the shrewd move came. She was the sole heir of Edward, her father's estate. How wonderful for him. No surprises then that on the 29th of October 1836, at St. Stephen's in Kirkstall, the Unitarian Edward married the Church of the Anglican Susan. Now, we only got a brief glimpse of Warley House because we're going to return to it later, but it wasn't suitable for a woman of this status. Instead, Edward, who's still spending a great deal of time in London on business, agreed to move in with his father-in-law into his house. And I put this on because this is in Burley, near where I was born. And here they are, Edward Grace, in this beautiful house of St. Anne's, with its extensive grounds, its conservatory, its greenhouses, its kitchen and flower gardens, its orchard. It's got its stables. It's got wonderful drawing and dining rooms, a breakfast room opening to a conservatory. It's upstairs, it's 6 bedrooms, and it's got servants' bedrooms. It's got butler's pantry, wine and other cellars. It is an absolutely beautiful estate. And so it's hardly surprising that the young married couple were very happy here, being waited on hand and foot. Now, the thing is that Edward had already paid for the old Warley House, which was in essence a 17th century outdated pile, to be botched up, I think is the best way of putting it. It wasn't suited to the needs of his talented young wife. So instead, he spent time getting the design of his new house called Meanwood Side right. And I put this slide on because it shows you the location of Warley House, the old place, the new house here, and look to the back of it as well. It was a huge property, and it was near the tan yard, which was again included in the sale, which Edward had leased out to make more money. And Edward had also developed another property called Hollin House on this estate. So this was really quite a change. And when he first started, he began to improve the water features. So he'd even hollowed out a lake here. So in that period from 1834 onwards, he starts to make changes. And here, what an absolutely wonderful early sketch of his estate by a man called Oswald Welker. And why it's great is it shows you the difference in style from the Warley House of the 17th century to the new house he built for himself and Susan. Beautiful. And why I particularly like this is it shows the grounds before he actually started to do much of his landscape work. The one thing that he did, however, include early on is this pillar. It's still there today in the park. Where on earth did this come from, and why did this classical pillar end up in his park? Well, quite simple. Edward, as I've said several times, was committed to Mill Hill Chapel. He played an important role there. And as the nonconformists prospered in Leeds, this really wasn't a suitable building for fashionable Victorians to be worshipping. It was a 17th century building, outdated, not particularly commodious, not comfortable in any shape, size, and form. And Edward was one of those who pushed for it to be rebuilt. And he volunteered to be secretary of the rebuilding committee from 1846 to 8. And you can see there these 2 classical pillars from the interior of it. And he's a typical Yorkshireman. He's not going to waste anything at all. And so he moves these 2 pillars to the landscape grounds. And this shows you the result of his wonderful work. And it's still there today and graces the eastern border of City Square. It is a true masterpiece by Bowman and Crowther, designed in the new dissenting Gothic style, a masterpiece. But there's the second of the pillars up in the park near the American Garden, which Edward built. And here I am with Brian Oates when his visit to Leeds. Now, as I've already noted, Edward was obsessive compulsive. Unfortunately, many of his diaries for the period 1841 to 1864 still survive. They are really just full of observation on the water levels of the Meanwood Beck and the steps that he was taking to improve the flow. The waters of the upper reaches of this stream have been diverted in 1843 when Ecup Reservoir had been created to provide clean drinking water for the people of Leeds. This action led to a marked diminution of flow, and this really irritated Edward, who immediately set about finding other sources of water to increase the supply. He diverted streams, he dug wells, he cleaned ditches to make sure that water flow increased through his garden. Not even that was enough, and he led a team that instigated a complete survey and this beautiful map which shows you where the Meanwood Beck entered his estate, right the way down to Monk Bridge. And in it, you could see all the people that were using the water, the paper mill, right the way down to the tannery, downstream to Wood Mill. All these people extracting water for the processes of industry and polluting it as well, which again irritated him immensely. What happened with the survey was it identified ways in which Edward could make even more improvements. And I love this photograph because what it shows you is a feature that's no longer there today. Those of you who know Meanwood Park well, where my arrow is here, this is where you park your cars today. And here you've got Meanwood side and a beautiful lake, which he put in front of this. He added weirs in the period 1834 to 5, huge number of ponds, Henry's Pool, Harris's Pool, Perch Pool, Violet Pool. They were all added over the next 20 years. And after 1858, he added more woods and a water feature on land that had been purchased at the time of the sale of the Englefield estate. And he added an American garden, which we caught a glimpse of where Brian and I were looking across the pool. He started to stock the waterways with perch in that year, which had been caught near Harewood. But Edward enjoyed the seclusion and peace of this quiet estate, and he was immensely irritated by the changes that started to be made in the district. Now, I've just put this on because this is a great piece, a page of his diary. Nothing about his family at all. It's all about foundations for a bridge, digging a drain, making a pool, adding waterfalls, putting the perch pool in. It's nothing to do with his family or his business at all. At the very end of his life, as it approaches 1864, he's there still on about Henry's Pillar near the pool there, and drains and excavations. Nothing at all about the family. But why I love it so much is very occasionally there is this little jewel of a watercolour added. And I think this is quite exquisite from his diary of the 7th of January, 1857, because it's a picture of the workmen who were working there to make the changes, planting all those different plants that he got from specialist nurserymen in Barnet, Bagshot, Whitby, Garforth, even Edinburgh, or planting the ferns that Edward had collected in the wild from Ilkley, Ravenstoke, Elland and Blackley. Now, nevertheless, Edward was a very paternalistic employee, and he was very much liked by the people of the estate. Because of his privacy, he'd gone to Mr. Hustler, who had a quarry just here, and purchased a huge amount of stone to build a massive high boundary wall that no longer exists, which hid this beautified grounds away from public gaze. Here's Meanwood Side, Holling House, and there is this wonderful American garden that he lavished a fortune on creating. But when Mr. Hustler then built this row of cottages where noisy quarrymen were residing, he was less than happy. But by the time of Edward's death in 1865, he had created one of the finest private gardens in Leeds. And today the people of the city still enjoy the delights of Meanwood Park. And what I'm marked here in red, these are the bridges which are still there today. And here what you have are the weirs and waterfalls, which he also put in place to beautify the park. This is a magnificent shot of Edward, thanks to Brian Oates. It's a wonderful, wonderful shot. It shows the character of the man. You can see, I love portraits because it showed you what a determined individual he was. But throughout, he was supported by Susan. She was the rock on which the whole family prospered, and she played a pivotal role in the education of her children, fundraising for charities, and even after the death of her husband in 1865, continued to improve the Meanwood estate. She loved travel and delighted in visiting other countries. She was an educated, cultured woman with true grit and did not hesitate to take on those who crossed her, and she prosecuted several people. Let's have a look at the family. Now, very tragically, they lost their first two children. Three boys survived into adulthood. And here they are, Edward and Susan's sons, Frank, William, and Charles. The annual accounts, which are at the back of his diary, show that these three young men had a fortune lavished on them, not only in their education, but in their clothes and the travel that they went on. I love going through these in details. These are the accounts for 1856, where Edward has £886 of fortune in that year. But in these accounts, it actually tells you that just before New Year, the family travelled to London, to Crystal Palace, and that short trip cost in today's money £6,825. The accounts are extremely detailed. I love the fact that he writes down exactly how much he spent on Mrs. Oates, wages, the garden, the books, the coats for his children, the coaches, the donations, the taxes, his fine horse, the boy's dress, right down to how much the pew cost and his chapel fees, the furniture, and a man after my own heart, a staggering amount on wine. But nevertheless, it had to creep in how much he paid on walls and drains and the upgrade of the tan pits of his business. Now, the boys were provided with private tutors, but the one who really made the biggest difference was Thomas Sutcliffe. 1828 to 1871, a renowned local artist, he taught them how to paint in watercolour. Now, many listening will be familiar with the Sutcliffe name because they'll be aware of the great photographer, Frank Meadow Sutcliffe, who was based for many years in Whitby. His father was Thomas, who taught the boys how to paint in watercolour. And in the Oates papers at West Yorkshire Archive is this beautiful watercolour by one of the boys. It doesn't say whom, but what you can see here, centre screen, is one of those bridges which of course Edward had paid to become across the beck. But all the boys were talented artistically. Now in 1820, as I mentioned earlier, Edward, he'd embarked on an extensive tour of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, where he had to contend with everything from pirates to the plague. And this wanderlust was clearly passed on to his children. This is Frank Oates in front of the restored Worley House, 17th century style. And here he is just before he departs for university. He was particularly interested in ornithology and was delighted to secure a place at Christ Church, Oxford, to study natural sciences. Now, Edward, as I mentioned, really hardly ever mentions anything about his children. But in 1861, he actually writes in his diary, Frank went to Oxford. I think it shows that he must have been immensely proud of his son's achievement. But like many family members of the Oates, they are a driven breed, and he overworked and was soon taken too ill. He left without completing his degree and instead opted to travel to Central and North America with the generous support of his wealthy father. When he returned in 1872, his contemporaries were impressed with the important collection of flora and fauna he had amassed during his adventures. He was immediately elected a Fellow of the Geographical Society in recognition of his groundbreaking work. Encouraged by this accolade, he decided on another foray. But his next adventure, he decided to follow in the footsteps of Livingstone, who in 1855 had journeyed along the Zambezi to Victoria Falls. There was still vast tracts of unexplored territory to the north, and he was determined to acquire accurate knowledge of the natural features of the country and study its flora and fauna there too. He was going to replicate the methodology he had applied in America and use his skill as a watercolorist to record what he saw. In 1873, he put a party of his friends together, which included his younger brother William and his faithful dog Rail, who features in the story later on. On the 5th of March, 1873, he set sail for Africa. Even today, this would be viewed as an exceptionally expensive undertaking, but for these two Leeds-born brothers, it was an exceptionally difficult, costly journey, and it was fraught with danger. His brother, however, had only agreed to join Frank for the first part of the journey through the Transvaal into Matabeleland. Now, these are just exquisite. These are the original watercolors. They are absolutely superb. And here we have Hunter's Camp in Zululand, hippo shooting on the Wami River. I think we'll all cringe today, but shooting the white rhinoceros in Zululand. Now, the party started wonderfully. There was great camaraderie and everything was going extremely well. But it came for the time for William to turn back, leaving his brother with the troublesome task of gaining the permission of King Lobengula to proceed to Victoria Falls. This permission was delayed, and this meant that the unhealthy season, in inverted commas, had arrived. Frank finally reached the Zambezi in December 1874, all the time collecting specimens of natural history and curiosities to bring back to England. The wet season had started and Victoria Falls was in full flood, and Frank was probably the first European to witness this spectacle, and he took his time to paint this spectacular view. It's wonderful. I put this next shot on because to the left you can see one of his original watercolors, and to the right how it was reproduced in the book his brother Charles published in 1881. Look at the wonderful quality of Victorian colour printing. Magnificent. So William's gone back and Frank's ploughing on. But unfortunately, he soon became ill after doing those watercolour paintings of Victoria Falls. He was seized by a fever and he died 12 days later on the 5th of February, 1875. He was only 35. An English physician, Dr. Bradshaw, happened to be in the area at the time and supervised the interment of his fellow countryman. Frank was buried in a remote spot on the Botswana-Zimbabwe border, and his journals and collections were carefully packed for the return journey to England. Shortly after his companions had started their trek back home, they noticed that his dog Rail was nowhere to be found, and so they turned back and found that the animal was guarding his master's final resting place, Frank's grave. Now it took from the 5th of February to the 8th of May, the news of his demise to reach Leeds. The Leeds Mercury noted, Frank had deeply endeared himself to a wide circle of friends by his genial, manly character, and had he lived, he would have added largely to those fields of distant inquiry and research for which his ardent love and travel and adventure peculiarly fitted him. Frank's effects found their way into the hands of the Reverend John Mackenzie, a missionary at Shoshbong, who arranged them to be sent to his younger brother Charles at Meanwoodside. When Charles received this collection, he understood that he needed specialist help with the rare material, and further study needed to be taken of all the magnificent specimens that were there. Today, a large number of these survive at Gilbert White's house at Selborne in Hampshire. And I've put this on to show what a fantastic job Charles did. He edited Frank's journal and he put together all Frank and William's superb drawings into a logical order. And these watercolor paintings were and drawings were worth their weight in gold. But what of William? Looking back, he'd have been extremely fortunate that he had not accompanied his brother Frank further, and he'd returned home to attend to business. Otherwise, Susan would have lost two of her sons. So what happened to William? He was to go into a foundry owned by this man, Joshua Buckton. He was a successful businessman who owned the Well House Foundry. And on the 8th of September, 1847, he married Mary, the daughter of Joseph Henry Oates. Edward decided that Joshua Buckton was rather a splendid gentleman, and so paid him £400 for a 3-year apprenticeship for William, who went on to play an active part in the company. As the Well House Foundry prospered, Joshua upgraded the accommodation his family lived in. He'd occupied a magnificent house already, this splendid Broomhill on literally Morallerton, just off Harrogate Road. But he wasn't content with that. Now he was going up in the world, and eventually he had Westleigh built for himself with a wonderful conservatory. And these wonderful shots have only just come to light at the Abbey House Museum. So thanks to my friends there for allowing me to use them this evening. William really liked Joshua Buckton, and the respect was mutual. And so it was not surprising when William began to court Joshua's daughter, Caroline Annie Buckton, the second of his daughters. Unfortunately, we shall see she had quite a cruel side, did this young woman. In 1869, poor Joshua was charged with getting rid of his father-in-law's estate. This was the Carr House estate that I mentioned several times. It was advertised on the 28th of July and described Lot 3 as all that commodious messuage standing on known by Carr House, lately the residence of Joseph Henry Oates, deceased, with the garden, pleasure grounds attached to. In addition to the house, there is a well-built farmhouse and extensive substantial farm buildings in the occupation of Mr. Fitton. All are supplied by a never-failing spring of excellent water. There are 21 acres attached. Now, in theory, this should have been a breeze. The sales blurb reads wonderfully. The above important and valuable property presents attractions and advantages of no ordinary character, situate within easy reach of the business parts of Leeds. It is in a neighbourhood celebrated for its rural aspect, its fertile soil, and its salubrious air. And being surrounded by the estates of large proprietors, it affords most admirable sites for mansions and first-class villas. It is throughout planted with well-grown timber, possesses a varied and undulating surface, and having in addition extensive frontages to excellent roads, it offers peculiar facilities for the erection of elegant residences, so much in request in this favourite locality. 14 years it took to sell it. 14 long years. Now, in that time, Joshua's business flourished. And by August 1883, he changed it to a limited company worth in today's money £10.25 million, of which he owned £1.5 million in shares. His son-in-law William owned just short of £500,000, and Charles George Oates, the youngest of the Oates family, £400,000. What an absolute fortune. Now, the thing is that 1865 had been a dreadful year for the Oates family one way and another because of deaths in the family, but the money rolled in. In 1889, Susan Oates died, and she left William half of the estate. He inherited such a large amount of money that when he put it with what he was earning with Joshua Buckton at the Well House Foundry, he was no longer a man that needed to have a tiresome daily routine. Instead, he just wanted to move away from Leeds. And he bought this magnificent house, Gestingthorpe Hall. In becoming a member of the gentry class, the landed gentry, he again followed a well-trodden path, in that wise to become a lord of the manor. His father's Unitarian beliefs were discarded, and he was replaced with support for the Church of England. He had become a true Anglican. And these are just such wonderful photographs of the inside of that house, which he and Caroline not only extended, but they made it fashionable inside to the age. And you can tell here what the theme was of the family, with all the animals that had basically been shot during his various adventures, and also as well the stuffed birds, which are not of today's taste, but were then. And you can see here's another of the room. The house is literally littered with this kind of stuffed animal, but it was because they were passionately interested in all flora and fauna. It wasn't simply the hunting. These were educated individuals who wanted to make a difference, as we shall see. Now, just because he's moved to Gestingthorpe doesn't mean that William and Caroline don't return to see Charles at Meanwoodside. They do. And this is, I think, a really exceptionally nice photograph showing William with his son Lawrence, more of whom later, with their nanny on the steps of Meanwoodside when they came on one of their regular visits to see Charles. Now, the four children of Caroline and William are captured here on this photograph. You've Lawrence there, who became famous as Captain Oates. You've got Brian, more of whom later, who sold the estate finally in 1917. You've Violet, who really all credit to her because she was responsible for making sure that a large amount of the Oates family archive were taken from Estingthorpe Hall when it was sold and deposited with what is today Leeds Archives. And she did that during wartime. How wonderful to her. And then there is Lillian, who eventually marries an opera singer and leaves the country. But what of Charles? We haven't said a great deal about him at the moment. We know quite a bit about him thanks to a lengthy obituary which appeared in the Leeds Mercury, in which they describe just how talented he was. He was a student at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, that he obtained a degree in law and history and had 2 prizes in 1863 for his work. After his degree, he went to London and in due course became a barrister of the Middle Temple. But in 1872, just before his brothers departed for African adventure, he decides to leave London and come back home and basically manage the large estate of Meanwoodside and also the many financial affairs because the family had investments all over the place. He comes back to his mother's side. His father had died in 1865, and with the absence of his 2 brothers, his widowed mother was quite lonely, and he stayed by her side. He was devoted to her. And he told a friend that for 17 years of his life, before his mother died, he never left her for longer than a week at a time. He spent time with her abroad, partly for the sake of their health, partly because they absolutely loved Sicily. Of course, he spent a great deal of time and effort editing and annotating his brother Frank's diary of the journey, and then producing the handsome volume in 1881 and a second volume, a second edition 9 years later, so 1890. He was also devoted to suffering animals. He hated cruelty to animals. And at an early period, probably about 1875, he joined G.R. Lees in the Society for the Abolition of Vivisection. And this interest never flagged. He never married, but he had a great number of friends who were devoted to him. But he was also a devoted uncle who spoilt his nephews and nieces, who must have loved coming to stay with him. As time, the Victorian period wore on, watercolours were in a way became passé because photography was the new trend. And here we have Violet's camera, and they loved taking photographs. And this is marvellous because not only did they enjoy the lavish grounds of what is today Meanwood Park, but they walked up the valley. And those who know Leeds well, this is Abbell Church without all the trees that surround it today, and them in a rowing boat. And I've just put here so that you can see who's who. And I do think it's funny because it's put a row, not a row. Look at the faces. They're beaming, having fun. Now, the period 1895 to 96, they were dark days for Caroline. She lost her father and her husband within 6 weeks of each other. Joshua was 76 and left her an estate worth about 8 million today. And then the following year, William died. He'd travelled out to Funchal in Madeira and unfortunately caught typhoid fever there and was buried within 24 hours later. He was a skilled artist and he left his portfolio of his sketches to the Royal Geographical Society in London. Yet it was South Africa that he loved the most. And in an ironic twist for someone so fond of hunting, he quickly realized that such pursuits were destroying whole species. And so he became an active member of the Committee of the Royal Geographical Society, formed with a view of preserving from extinction some of those wild animals which were now threatened with extermination. I think that's remarkable. Just look at the period, 1895 to 6. How forward-looking was that? So Caroline has to contend with that blow. But she was a woman of steel. And upon the death of Charles on the 8th of January 1902, she lost little time in coming from Gestingthorpe Hall to Meanwood Side to actually arrange for the content she wanted transferred down south to Essex. When I had the privilege of staying with Brian, one of the most incredible things he has in his archive is a tiny little notebook. That notebook, written in by Caroline, is an absolute treasure trove of information as to what was in Meanwood Side. The first part deals with the fact that Lawrence and Brian are given 15,000 each and the property of Meanwood Side jointly to be placed in the hands of trustees. Lillian and Violet, they've £20,000 each, a fortune. She packs up the boxes of belongings to Edward, Susan, Frank, Joseph Henry, Charles and Miss Wainhouse. All the bottles of wine, even Christmas cards were there. Every wall of Meanwood Side was covered in paintings, 12 in the drawing room by Sutcliffe. They're all packed up. In the green room, there are numerous photographs, including 2 of Meanwood Side I've used this evening. There were another 8 paintings of Sutcliffe. There were 9 of his in the spare bedroom. There was crockery, some of which Brian still uses to this very day in London. But there was so much crockery, she had to send a huge amount to Heppers to get disposed of. But then there was the silver. There wasn't just the silver of the Oates family, which was extensive, everything from salvers to candlesticks, right the way through to cruets, strainers, scissors, teapots. It goes on and on. But there was also the Grace family silver that Susan had brought there, including more salvers, candlesticks, mugs and saucepots. And then everything that was to be sent to Heppers. Meanwood Side must have been bursting at its seams. Now here are the 2 brothers in later life. Lawrence, to the left, was Caroline's favourite, and her treatment of Brian, to the right, was at times simply shameful. Captain Lawrence Edward Grace Oates of the 6th Inniskilling Dragoons became a legend of self-sacrifice when, as a member of Scott's ill-fated Antarctic expedition of 1912, he chose to sacrifice himself rather than impede the progress of his comrades. On his 17th of March, his 32nd birthday, he walked from the party into the blizzard, never to be seen again. Unfortunately, the whole of Scott's party perished, but the following year, when they found Scott's diaries, he had written, had Scott, Oates slept through the night, hoping not to wake, but he awoke in the morning. It was blowing a blizzard. Oates said, I am just going outside and maybe some time. He went outside and we have not seen him since. We knew that Oates was walking to his death, but though we tried to dissuade him, we knew it to be an act of a brave man and an Englishman, and he truly has gone down in history as a hero. But what of Brian? Brian Oates had been born in Holland House and he had been very fond of his older brother. They had a jokey relationship, but Laurie treated him as someone he could order about to do things for him. Caroline, his mother, never rated him at all. When Louis Bernacchi approached her about helping him to write a biography on Lawrence, she told him she didn't have any of his letters, despite the fact she kept all her correspondence from her beloved son safely stored in the attic. She vociferously opposed the idea of a biography, leaving Bernacchi with a great disadvantage without access to family archives. So Bernacchi approached Brian, to the right here, who was happy to talk about his brother. Once Caroline heard about this, she immediately disinherited him and left guesting Thorpe Hall and all its contents to Lillian and Violet. Throughout Brian's childhood, she'd made no secret of the fact that Lawrence was a favourite and seemed to delight in making Brian out as though he was an idiot. But this was far from the truth. He was the accomplished scholar. As his grandson Brian recently noted, although Captain Oates applied often to get into university, he failed. Oxford told him, please don't apply again. Your marks are well below those required by the university. On the other hand, Brian here not only got into university, but an excellent university, Trinity College, Cambridge, and he fought valiantly in World War I. Now, the brothers' trustees in 1902 let Meanwood side to this man, Edward Kitson Clark, former president of the Thoresby Society. How apt. He became an engineering apprentice who went on to publish that magnificent history of the Kitsons of Leeds, 1837 to 1937. And he had an extremely distinguished career. He and his wife loved Meanwood side. And eventually, in 1917, in the First World War, Brian Oates, now the sole owner of Meanwood side after his brother had died in such tragic circumstances, decided to sell. And the Oates estate, the last of the Oates estates, was to go. Now then, I've finished on this wonderful photograph. Here we, on the left, have Brian Oates and his grandson. I think this shows perfectly the love of a grandfather for his grandson, the joy of being in each other's company. When Brian Oates sold Meanwood side in 1917, it brought to an end the family's link with Leeds, the town where the wealth of this family had been generated for over 2 centuries. Now, that young man in the photograph to the left, it's now the gentleman in the photograph to the right. I must acknowledge the wonderful support of Brian Oates, who so generously had me as his guest for several days so that I could systematically go through his extensive collection of archival material, and also for sharing with me not only his wonderful company, but his in-depth knowledge of his family. Without his support, this lecture would not have been possible. I also need to thank the staff at West Yorkshire Archive Service Leeds and my friends Patrick Gillett, Alan Slomson and Sue Alexander at the Thoresby Society for their support. Thank you all very much. Questions?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That was a superb talk. The amount of material, primary source material that you've unearthed just contributed so much to that. Just fantastic. Shall we throw this one open to the floor? Do you want to unmute yourselves? And if anyone has any questions.
Hi, Chris. I've got a question. Well, it's a sort of a footnote, really. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Hear you. Yep.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I think Frank, after going to North America, went to Guatemala for a year. And then he got his qualification for the Royal Geographic Society.
How wonderful. I didn't know that.
All right. And another thing I noticed, I think Frank was an extensive diary keeper as well, like his father for Meanwood side. And he kept diaries while he was trekking to Victoria Falls. And the interesting thing I found was that on the day he went to Victoria Falls, the only entry in his diary that day said, "I visited the falls, a day never to be forgotten."
Oh, that's wonderful phraseology, isn't it? That paints it beautifully in the mind of Frank.
Yeah, just to say that it'd taken nearly 2 years to get there, and then that was his sole contribution on the day he got there.
I
It was,
always think about his poor father, who's the poor Oates family, who are supporting all this, because it must have cost it must have cost an absolute fortune. It really must. His father tragically died in 1865 and didn't see his son prosper and gain such fame for the quality of the work that he undertook. It's amazing. They're such an amazing family.
and my last comment, Steve, is I think you must have had 365 days of Christmases discovering all this information.
I've got to tell you, I went, first of all, I'm writing a book with Rachel Unsworth at the moment on the history of Chapel Allerton. So I went to actually find more out about the Oates and their homes in Chapel Allerton. But as I went through the archival material, it was obvious that there was a great deal of it missing. And it made no logic to me at all. And so I contacted Gestingthorpe Local History Society to ask if they had any archival material of the Oates. And I am so grateful to them, gave me an email address. And as a result of that, I managed to get in touch with Brian, and the rest, they say, is history, because I could reunite the two halves of the Oates archive to tell what I hope is a coherent story.
Thank you.
Can I can I put a question to Stephen?
Yes.
Good evening, Michael.
Good evening, Steve. Where does Charles Oates fit into all this? Who was a colleague of Alf Mattison, the socialist pioneer, and with whom he used to go on travels on the continent?
Well, it's interesting observation. It's that the answer is that nothing is mentioned about politics really, about the latter, Charles and the latter Oates family. They keep that well hidden, whereas earlier on, Mike, there's an awful lot of material about the Oates family and politics, because they were Whig. And what's very interesting, what I found fascinating, is their banker, of course, are the Becketts of Leeds, Tory, absolutely Tory through. And as you know, stood for being an MP for Leeds. On their border is Edward Oates. He is Whig. And what amuses me about the location of the primary school is it's right on the border of Meanwood side. It's the other side of the road. And I just wonder if Beckett's thought, take that, Oates, you want peace and quiet, which he did. I'm going to put a primary school on your border. But amongst the papers, and I'll share some of this with you, I didn't touch on it this evening because I was trying to just keep a firm grip on the narrative. But there's a wonderful one where the Tories win and a member of the Oates family disagrees with this result and gets into the room where the Tories are celebrating and throws itching powder into the air. And the whole party goes out of the room in all directions. So I can't answer your question, is the honest answer to that, Michael. But what I can do is say that they were extremely active. Edward, for example, when he is in London, this is before he marries Susan. He is one of those that the Tories decide isn't fit to have a vote. And Edward is absolutely infuriated by this. And there's a great bit in the paper about Edward traveling from London to challenge that. And the fact that he can prove that he now owns Warley House, he can prove that he's in it certain weeks of the year. And as a result of that, he is then allowed to have a vote, to cast a vote. So, as I say, there's quite a rich bit of material on the votes and politics, but not that which you want them to know about.
But they did travel a lot in the company of Edward Carpenter and one of the Lister family. And they were, quite clearly, they were political buddies as well as sort of grand tour people.
I think the thing that strikes you as you go through all the Oates family from 1700 to 1917 is the staggering wealth. They have their bad times, but by and large, they are literally multi-millionaires.
And what happened to the estate in Essex, Steve? Gestonthorpe Hall. How long did they keep that for?
Well, I think one of the tragic things of Caroline's will is that it's left to Violet and Lillian. Lillian marries, and Violet's left in charge, and she comes across as a very gentle, very kind, again very caring, a bit like Joseph Henry, very nice person. But she has been brought up to be a lady, not an estate manager. That wasn't part of her role at all. And she decides to sell, which is why she contacts Leeds Archives. You know, a lot of the correspondence starts in 1941, in the middle of the Second World, at the end of the Second World War. So she's desperate to offload it. She offers it to the National Trust, but she wants paying for it, and the National Trust can't afford it, and therefore it's put on up for sale. And between 1946 to 1948, sale eventually goes through. Brian tries to buy it, but his sister finds out that he's the anonymous buyer in the background, and so the sale is paused because they really don't want to, in a way, go against the will of their mother. So it eventually comes out of the family hands. But what's fantastic is, of course, the Oates family museum is there at Selborne, so there's the material there. They donate the archival material. There are things in Leeds museums and galleries, particularly maps and plans that they donated. There are books in Mill Hill Chapel, Leeds, which they donated. The books in Leeds Library. What a generous family as well. But sadly, the house went out of the family. And obviously in 1917, the last of the Leeds properties has gone.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? I can see there's a comment in the chat for you, Steve, from Lucy Evans, thanking you for the amazing history and wanting you to write a book, which I think you're sort of in the course of, aren't you, a bit with
well,
Chapel Allerton work.
Where I'm at the moment, I'm hoping this time next year that there will be a hardback book on the history of Chapel Allerton, very much like the Hunslet one I produced with Kevin, available. And when that's over, what I intend to do with all the material about the Oates family in Leeds is to write an extensive article for the Thoresby Society Journal. So it will eventually see the light of day, but I think you're 3 years away from that at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll look forward to that. Anybody else? I think that looks like it's time to wrap things up. So just to thank you so much again, Steve, for such a great talk. We've all really enjoyed it. Really good.